When you think about participation in your classroom, who comes to mind first? Is it the students raising their hands, the ones who always have something to say, the ones that are quick, confident, and ready with an answer? Now, think about everyone else. The quiet processors, the students building confidence, the ones still developing language. Are they participating, or are they being left out of how we define participation? These are great questions to consider to ensure that we recognize and honor what participation means for all students. So, let's jump in. Whether you're planning your first lesson or celebrating your 20th year in the language classroom, I understand exactly where you are. I'm Joshua Cabral, and I'm also a language teacher in my 29th year of teaching. Now, I also have the opportunity to support schools and teachers all across the country who are working towards increasing proficiency and building confidence in their students. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast, with over 200 episodes of practical strategies tested in real classrooms just like yours and mine. So let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and I thank you, as always, for finding the time and taking the time to hang out with me here on the podcast each week. It's one of the many things that I know that you do as an educator that makes you incredible at what you do. Today, we're talking about participation. Now, this is a topic that comes up all the time in our classrooms. It's not just in our language classrooms, but every classroom talks about participation. There are even some grading systems that include participation as part of the grade, so we always talk about this. So we should probably have a solid understanding of exactly what participation is and what we expect of students when we say they are a good participant in class or not. And I don't think we always have a really clear understanding of what that is because we often assume that we are defining it in the same way. So let's reflect a little bit on this idea of participation. And when we say a student participates, what do we usually mean by that? We usually mean that they are raising their hand, or that they speak quickly, that they answer correctly, or that they are contributing out loud. And without even realizing it, we start to associate participation with talking more means participating more. And so when we look at what students are doing in our classroom, and maybe we are even giving a participation grade, is that based on the ones that are speaking? Because we associate talking more with participating more. But here's a different way to think about this, or maybe even the problem with it, that definition works for really a very small group of students. Because if you take a look at your classes, any class that you teach, and think of that one student, the one who always has their hand up, they're confident, they're quick, they're comfortable with the language. That's their demeanor. They are ready, willing, happy. You've created a situation and an atmosphere where they are very comfortable participating. Now think of maybe another student. They're listening carefully, they're processing, they're rehearsing what they want to say. They might even be ready to write it down before they say it, but they don't speak as quickly or nearly as often. And we have this situation happening in our classroom with these two types of students. What happens? One student is seen as highly engaged, and the other is seen as not participating. And that's where we need to pause when we look at this word participation, because does participation just mean speaking in class and engaging through verbal communication in the classroom? Now, in our language classes, there is a big part of what we do that is presentational speaking, interpersonal speaking, and all of that is communication, and all of that is seen as participation as well. But students are engaged in ways that aren't just verbal speaking. They're engaged in ways where they are listening, where they are making meaning of what they're reading, where they are writing. All of that is communication. And we sometimes look at just the verbal output or the interpersonal as the only form of communication. But we have our communication modes where we have our interpersonal, but we also have our interpretive communication, whether that's listening or reading. And we have our presentational writing or presentational speaking, where students are working more individually in a prepared way with their communication. So when we are considering what participation is in our classroom and you are attributing a grade to participation in your classroom, maybe take some time to look at how do you define participation in your classroom. Are students just receiving the higher participation grades because they are speaking more, they have the demeanor that puts themselves out there, where they're more comfortable doing that? Or are we also engaging in communication that is in the other modes and looking at that as equally important to participation and including that in their participation grade? Because what can also happen sometimes is those students who are very verbal, and we look at them as the good participants, they're not the best readers sometimes or the best writers in the other modes. And sometimes you'll have those students that are great in all the modes, and that's wonderful. But when we use that word participation, let's remember that we have all of our communication modes that students are engaging in, and to make sure that we are honoring all of the modes when we look at that word participant or participation. In a traditional sense, and when we think of participation, this is a system that unintentionally rewards confidence sometimes over communication, or speed over thinking, or personality over proficiency. Now think about that for a minute and let that sink in. Our participation systems, what do they truly reward? Is it confidence over communication? Do we have students that are engaging in communication, but maybe they don't have the best confidence? And you might have those students who are really high in confidence, but their proficiency level is not nearly there in terms of some of those other students who don't have the demeanor so much to put themselves out there. Or are we rewarding speed over taking the time to think and really bring an answer together before they engage verbally? So put that lens over your classroom in terms of the way you're looking at participation and what is being rewarded. And are we unintentionally rewarding confidence over communication or speed over thinking, or sometimes and almost always personality over proficiency and the demeanor of the student? So what does this mean for students who are processing more slowly, or they're still on that road to building their confidence in the language, or they're still developing language? They can easily be labeled as not participating. Even when they are listening intently and deeply, they're making meaning of what they're reading and what they're listening to, they're mentally rehearsing language. All of that is their way of engaging and participating. But do we see that as participation? Because when we see participation as just about speaking and not really about engaging with meaning, that can be a little bit of an issue for us in the classroom. So participation is not just about the speaking, it's about engaging in all of the modes. And if we miss that, we miss a huge part of what language learning actually is. So let's be a little bit more realistic about the choice to engage. Sometimes we look at as a student is making this choice of whether or not they're going to engage. And there are individual behavior issues to consider, and those should not be discounted. I completely understand. There are also cultural factors to keep in mind and personal demeanor of students. So all of that plays in when we look at the individual student. But in this conversation, it's more about looking at how we generally view the concept of participation and how we might consider engagement looking a little bit differently than maybe we typically define it in our language classrooms. So again, not particularly at the individual level, because you will have those very individual differences, student demeanor, cultural reasons, behavior problems that might come in, all of that. This is the reality of our classrooms. So if we move beyond the individual student and look just more at the generality of our classrooms and how are we viewing communication. So, as we look at participation, if you listen to the podcast, I love to help shift our thinking. So, here's our shift in thinking or our change in perspective when it comes to participation. And that participation is evidence of engagement and communication, not just students who talk. Now, if we look at communication as only interpersonal and only talking, then we're going to see a lot of students as not participating. But again, I will put it out there. Change this perspective for yourself. Participation is evidence of engagement and communication and not just who talks. Because students can engage and communicate in ways that are not always the verbal output because we have other communication modes, and they're called communication modes because they involve actual communication as well. So how can we redefine this word participation then? So what can that look like if it's not just students that are talking? It can be students who are listening with intent, true purpose, trying to find meaning. They're writing a response. They're reacting to a partner. Maybe it's just a physical reaction or a face that they make or a smile, something that it's not necessarily verbal output. Or they're preparing language before speaking. Or they're using gestures or signals, but they're showing comprehension in some ways that aren't necessarily always the verbal output. Now, I do not want to downplay how important interpersonal communication is. It absolutely is. It's pivotal. It's the reason most people engage in language learning and language acquisition. But in terms of how we are defining a participant in our classrooms, we need to look beyond that idea that it's just verbal communication and that it can come out in the other communication modes. And when we broaden that definition, more students suddenly exist in our participation lens in the classroom. So I want to offer you a couple of tips or ways of looking at participation in your classroom. And the first is these 4 keys, I will call them, to better participation. And to make this work, participation needs to be visible. That means that students know what participation looks like. They know what you expect. They know that it is not just verbal communication, but all of the communication modes, and that is visible to students. They know what participation looks like. And then also it should be structured. Tasks require engagement. And that means that it's not always going to be interpersonal engagement, but it can be in the other communication modes as well. And we also want it to be supported, where students have scaffolding that is helping them and supporting them as they engage with language. And then we also want to make sure that it's always purposeful. It is connected to our communication goals and not just compliance. So when you're looking at participation in your classroom, if you look at these 4 key elements, it'll help you to reframe how you see participation in your classroom. The first one is to make sure that it is visible to students. Students know what participation looks like. You want to make sure that participation is structured. These are tasks that require engagement, and they are supported, which means that students have the language scaffolding that they need to participate. And then it's purposeful. It's connected to your communication goals, and it's not just compliance in terms of saying, oh, you are a good participant because you spoke 10 times in class today, or you're not a good participant, or you have a low participation grade because you didn't raise your hand in class today. But it's rather than that, it is connected to communication goals and not just that idea of compliance. Because even a student who is talking a lot in class and raising their hand a lot in class, that doesn't mean that they have the proficiency level that you're looking for. They just have a demeanor that allows them to put themselves out there in that way more so than other students who may have a higher proficiency level. But how are we going to grade the participation? And we want to make sure that it is tied to the communication goal and not just compliance. So to put that in an example of what that might look like in your classroom, instead of a turn and talk, you're going to turn and talk to your partner about something, try this instead. Ask students to write their answer first and then share with a partner, because you're going to have those students that need the time to prepare and are not the quick thinkers or the fast processors or have the demeanor where they can just jump right into the conversation. You will have some students that can do that, but we want to make sure that we are honoring the fact that other students are processing differently. So instead of the turn and talk right away, way, allow them to jot down some ideas and then share with a partner. And when you do this, more students are going to be prepared to engage. More students are going to end up speaking because they had the time to process. And more students are going to feel successful because you set it up so that they have the confidence to engage, not necessarily right off the cuff. Now, when you get up into much higher proficiency levels, you're at those level 4 or 5 college level classes where students have that level and that demeanor and that processing speed and that proficiency level at that upper intermediate advanced level where they can do a lot of this spontaneous on-the-spot interpersonal speaking. But for students that are lower than that proficiency level, they will benefit from allowing them to process before engaging. And all of that processing time, what they're writing down, what they are collecting in terms of their thoughts, all of that is engagement with the language. That is participation. And let's not discount that. So you take this idea of what it looks like in your classroom and how you're defining participation, what your lens is on that. I want to ask you to try just this simple shift that you can do in your class right away tomorrow. You don't have to prepare anything. So let's make this super simple and very, very practical. So ask yourself 2 questions before you do your next activity. And the first one is, what do I want students to do with language? And then how can they show that in more than one way? Now, many times that one way in the past has been the verbal output, the interpersonal communication. But if you want students to engage with language, how can they do it in more than one way? And that's it. You don't need to redesign everything. So that means that you're allowing students 2 possible ways to participate. So take any activity you already use and add 1 more way to participate that is not just interpersonal speaking. For example, students can say their response to a partner or write their response first and then maybe share, or maybe just keep it as a written response. Because remember, presentational communication is a form of communication. Now, again, I'm not saying let's not do interpersonal communication in the classroom. I'm just trying to reframe what we value in terms of participation in our classroom and honoring that participation can look differently than the way we always assume it looks in our classrooms. And so what does this do when you have students write instead of maybe speak? And maybe next time you are definitely going to have them speak, but sometimes have them write and then maybe have them write and then speak. But again, they have different ways to engage with the language. So what does this do? It's going to help to lower anxiety. It's going to actually increase participation because you'll see that students are actually engaged. Whereas if they didn't have the opportunity to write down an answer or a thought or a synthesis of whatever you were reading, then they maybe would not have contributed at all if the only way to engage was verbally. And so you're going to see this difference in how students are participating. And then perhaps they can build on that later. So again, not for every single activity that you're doing, but once in a while when you're doing an activity, can you provide students with various ways to engage and see each of them as equally valuable ways to demonstrate participation and engagement? And as you're doing these activities with students, during the activity, you can tell students what participation looks like. You could say that some students, participation in this sense is going to be interpersonal communication. For some students, it's going to be writing. And when you look at it as engagement and not participation, you will see that there is real evidence for engagement with the language in ways that you may not have considered because of our narrow understanding has traditionally been defined as in our classroom. So when you make this shift, what you will likely notice is that more students, you would say, are engaged, that participation feels more equitable. Students are taking more risks because there's more than just one way to engage with the language. And you will hear more voices over time because you're building confidence in students in the other modes, and then they'll transfer that to their interpersonal speaking. And then something really important happens. Students start to see themselves as participants. And you will see that your grades for participation are much more equitable because it's not based on fast processing or student demeanor or something like that, but it's truly more equitable. It's not based on compliance, and then you can really base your grades on proficiency. Now, this is one of those situations where you can say, yes, I'll try that out, but it could probably be a bit hard to sustain. And this is the honest part. It can be hard to sustain sometimes because most teachers would agree with the idea that I just put out there. But it's hard to sustain because we don't always have that clear definition of participation. You need to change that idea of what participation is. If you're sticking to that verbal idea of participation, this is going to be hard to sustain. So make sure that you have a clear definition of what participation is for you in your classroom, and then have that system for designing tasks where there's more than one option to engage. And then make sure you have a way to align participation with proficiency. So not just saying that because students are participating verbally that they have a higher proficiency level. That means that they have more confidence or more outgoing demeanor, but that doesn't mean that they have the proficiency level that you're looking for. And then also have a fair way of assessing participation in your classroom, that it doesn't just look one way, but you're honoring engagement with the language rather than participation. Because we don't want to fall back onto who's raising their hand and who's talking in class, and that's what we define as a good participant, because they are all engaging in different ways and the different communication modes with the language. So if you're listening to this concept and you're thinking, yes, this is exactly what I want and this is what I need, but maybe I just need a little bit more of a system for it, well, I want to point you toward my Quick Win PD course, Participation That Works for All Students. The link is in the show notes, or you can go to my website, wlclassroom.com/participation, wlclassroom.com/participation, because this shift is really powerful, but it needs structure to stick. So in this course on Participation That Works for All Students, you will learn to redefine participation in a way that supports language development, and then to design lessons with multiple participation pathways, and then to align participation with communication and proficiency goals, and then make participation visible and consistent. And it's designed to be simple. These courses are about 30 minutes of your time. They're clear, practical strategies ready for tomorrow. They are taking the ideas that you heard in this podcast episode today, and you're going deeper. And there's a whole audio course that goes along with it. You can listen to it anywhere, but then there are really extensive notes with really clear examples across all proficiency levels with a reusable template, as well as a personalized PD certificate and feedback on a lesson that you submit. So let's come back to one idea before we close this out, and it's that participation isn't about who speaks the most. It's about who is engaging with the language. And when we expand that definition, more students show up, more students succeed, and more students are growing in their proficiency. So this isn't about totally different activities. It's about different pathways for students to engage with the language and how you are designing those lessons in your classroom. So for this week, try the 2 ways to participate task. That it's not just turn and talk to your partner. It's not just talk about this, just show your understanding verbally, but give another way for students to engage. And then see what changes. And if you want a clear, repeatable system to build from, I will once again point you towards Participation That Works for All Students, my Quick Win PD course. The link is in the show notes, or you can get it on my website, wlclassroom.com/participation. So thank you for listening and for all of the incredible work you're doing to help your students become confident, real-world communicators. And if you want more ideas to bring proficiency-focused strategies to your teaching, you'll find PD options for you and your school in the show notes and on my website. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. And let's stay connected on social media. You can find me at WL Classroom pretty much everywhere. You'll also find lots of ideas, suggestions, and resources on my website, WLClassroom.com. Now stay curious, keep learning, and continue the great work you do inspiring and supporting your students.